millionaire returns home after months away, expecting silence, order, and control. But instead, he walks into a scene that stops him cold. Inside his mother's bedroom, his 78-year-old mother who suffers from advanced Alzheimer's, he finds someone he never expected. A black housekeeper, newly hired, is kneeling in prayer beside the frail woman. To him, it looks like manipulation, an intrusion into his family's private world. To her, it was nothing more than a desperate attempt to calm an anxious soul who begged for peace. But in that instant, anger drowns out reason. Accusations fly. Loyalty is questioned. And a single decision made in rage sets off a chain of events that neither of them could have imagined. What begins as a moment of prayer soon unravels into a storm of hidden evidence, dangerous secrets, and a truth powerful enough to destroy lives. Because from the second he opens that door, nothing will ever be the same again. Before we start, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Edward Miller was a man who lived in a world of polished marble floors, endless glass windows, and the kind of silence only wealth could buy. At 50 years old, he was the image of control, a self-made millionaire who built his empire on discipline and precision. His mansion in Beverly Hills stood as both a fortress and a trophy, towering over the hills like proof of his success. For most, a home was a place of warmth and comfort. For Edward, it was a stage carefully curated to reflect power. But behind that stage was someone easily forgotten: his mother, Margaret Miller. At 78, Margaret had once been vibrant, known in her circles for her charity work and her sharp wit. Alzheimer's had changed all of that. The disease slowly stripped her of memories, leaving her vulnerable, dependent, and confined to the very rooms that once hosted gala dinners and charity events. Where she had once laughed with friends, she now sat in silence, staring into the distance as if searching for fragments of a fading world. Edward visited when his schedule allowed, though his trips had become fewer and shorter. Business always came first. To him, his mother's care was another task to be delegated, another item on the long list of responsibilities that could be managed with money. He hired staff, he paid doctors, and he expected results. In his eyes, love was expressed through control, through making sure she was looked after, even if he wasn't the one providing the comfort. Naomi Carter entered this world quietly, without fanfare. At 39, she was no stranger to hard work. Years as a nursing assistant had given her both skill and compassion, but after leaving that profession for more flexible cleaning jobs, she found herself walking into homes like Edward's, spaces dripping with wealth but often starved of warmth. To Edward, she was just the housekeeper. To Margaret, she was a gentle presence in an otherwise lonely life. Naomi noticed things others didn't. The way Margaret's hands trembled when she reached for her teacup. The way her breathing quickened when shadows grew long in the evening. The way fear flickered in her eyes when she couldn't remember where she was. These moments, invisible to most, were signals Naomi couldn't ignore. And in those fragile moments, sometimes Margaret would reach out, asking for something simple. Not money, not medicine, but prayer. A quiet hand to hold, a soft voice to soothe her. For Margaret, prayer wasn't about religion. It was about memory, a rhythm of words and faith that connected her to who she once was. It gave her a sense of calm when nothing else could. Naomi understood this, not because it was in her job description, but because she knew what it meant to care for someone's dignity when the world had already taken so much from them. Edward, however, didn't see these small acts of compassion. From his perspective, everything in his mother's life was supposed to be tightly controlled: medications, routines, staff schedules. He wanted stability at all costs, even if that stability resembled sedation more than comfort. For 3 long months, Edward had been away, consumed by business deals and high-stakes meetings. He left the house under strict instructions, trusting that his mother's care would continue according to his plan. He never imagined that anything or anyone would disrupt the order he had built. And yet, Disruption was already brewing inside those pristine mansion walls. Margaret's condition was worsening, not only from the disease itself but from the heavy doses of medication prescribed to her. Naomi had begun to notice inconsistencies, pills given too frequently, doses that seemed too strong for a woman of Margaret's size. She didn't confront anyone, not yet, but she carried a quiet unease, the kind that gnawed at her when she lay awake at night. Still, Naomi kept showing up, day after day, bringing small moments of comfort where she could. She prayed with Margaret when asked. She straightened the covers, reminded her of old memories, and played soft music to ease her fears. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't noticed, but it mattered. In a house that felt more like a museum than a home, Naomi became the one thing that made Margaret feel human again. But Edward's return would change everything. He wasn't the type of man to appreciate gestures that couldn't be measured in numbers or results. To him, control was safety. Anything that challenged his authority, even a whispered prayer at his mother's bedside, would feel like an invasion. As Edward's private jet descended into Los Angeles that evening, he thought about the deals he had secured, the investors he had impressed, and the empire he was building. What he didn't think about was Naomi Carter, or the quiet prayers she whispered in his absence. But within hours, her presence would become impossible to ignore. Because when Edward walked through the doors of his mansion unannounced, what he saw inside his mother's room would ignite a storm that would reveal secrets, test loyalties, and force everyone involved to confront truths they'd long avoided. And once it began, there would be no turning back. Edward Miller arrived at his mansion late in the afternoon, briefcase in hand, ready to reclaim the sense of order he believed money had bought him. For 3 months he had been away, chasing deals across the globe. Now he wanted control restored, every detail of his household back in its proper place. But what awaited him inside his mother's master bedroom was far from order. There, he saw Naomi Carter kneeling beside his frail mother, her hands folded, her head bowed in prayer. Margaret Miller, the once formidable woman now weakened by Alzheimer's, sat beside her, whispering along to words she barely remembered. To Naomi, it was a moment of peace. To Edward, it was trespass. His face hardened, his body tensed. Without asking, without listening, he drew his conclusion. The maid was using faith to manipulate his vulnerable mother. Fury took over. He ordered Naomi to her feet, his voice sharp with accusation. He claimed she was brainwashing Margaret, exploiting her confusion. Naomi tried to explain. Margaret had begged her for prayer, begged for calm, but Edward would not hear it. In his mind, this was betrayal, an assault on the control he prized above all else. Within minutes, he fired her on the spot, demanding she pack her things and leave the mansion within the hour. Naomi's world shattered. For her, this job wasn't just cleaning rooms, it was survival. Every dollar counted toward rent, bills, and caring for her 16-year-old son, Jordan. Yet as Edward's fury echoed through the halls, Naomi stayed composed. Unknown to him, she carried something far more powerful than fear. Quietly, she slipped her hand into her pocket, switched off a small voice recorder, and tucked it into her bag. Alongside it were photographs she had discreetly taken of Margaret's prescription bottles. Back in her small Los Angeles apartment that night, the reality of her situation pressed down on her. Overdue bills piled on the kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the cramped space. Jordan tried to console her, reminding her she was more than just a maid. He believed in her strength, even when she felt stripped of dignity. Naomi, though weary, couldn't ignore what she had uncovered. Those photographs showed something deeply troubling. Margaret's prescriptions contained dangerously high doses of sedatives, amounts that could push an elderly woman into near-vegetative silence. Her instincts as a former nursing assistant came alive. She compared dosages to medical guidelines, her hands trembling as she realized the truth. These weren't simple mistakes. They were deliberate, Someone was keeping Margaret quiet through overmedication. Naomi's unease deepened into determination. She began to investigate further. Long nights were spent cross-checking names, digging into the physician listed on the prescriptions. Dr. Stephen Blake. What she discovered was staggering. This wasn't a respected doctor. It was a man who had already lost his license in 2 states for malpractice involving elderly patients. Yet somehow, he was practicing again in California under a temporary license. A man stripped of credibility had been entrusted with Margaret Miller's care. The injustice was clear, but Naomi's courage made it undeniable. She compiled her findings: photos, dosage notes, and recordings of Margaret's fleeting lucid moments. In one, Margaret's weak voice admitted that her son called her a burden, that he threatened to send her away, and that she wasn't allowed to see friends. Edward's empire was built on image, yet within his mansion walls lived a woman treated as an inconvenience. Naomi knew this was bigger than herself. She reached out to the California Department of Public Health, Elder Abuse Division, and connected with investigator Patricia Alvarez. Patricia, sharp and unyielding, immediately recognized Naomi's diligence. She didn't see a fired maid. She saw a whistleblower. Naomi's report was logged as high priority, her evidence carefully catalogued. For the first time, Naomi felt a glimmer of power against the weight of Edward's influence. Meanwhile, Edward celebrated his return to dominance. With Naomi gone, he boasted to his assistant, Laura Chun, that the house was finally free from outside influence. In his arrogance, he never suspected that the woman he dismissed so easily had already set forces in motion that would unravel everything he built. Naomi turned her tiny kitchen into a war room. Prescription lists covered the walls. Medical regulations were highlighted and annotated. Timelines of Margaret's decline were pinned beside stacks of research. Jordan watched in awe as his mother transformed from housekeeper to investigator. She wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for survival, for truth, for dignity. Patricia soon introduced Naomi to Michael Rivera, an attorney specializing in elder abuse cases. Moved by her courage, he offered to represent her pro bono. Together, they crafted a legal strategy, one that targeted not just Edward Miller but also the corrupt doctor enabling him. For Naomi, this wasn't revenge. It was protection for Margaret, and for countless others whose voices had been silenced under the weight of wealth and neglect. But with every new revelation, the stakes grew higher. Edward's influence was vast, his resources deep. Taking him on meant risking exposure, retaliation, and danger. Yet Naomi pressed forward, fueled by the memory of Margaret's trembling hands and whispered prayers. The storm was gathering. Naomi had planted the seeds of a case that could not be ignored. Investigators prepared warrants. Journalists caught wind of the whispers. And Edward, still blind in his arrogance, remained confident that his power was untouchable. What he didn't know was that his empire stood on the edge of collapse, and the maid he dismissed was about to bring it all crashing down. The storm Naomi had sensed for weeks finally broke. It began with a warrant, cold, official, stamped with authority, and ended with the sound of footsteps pounding across marble floors. On a quiet morning, Edward's mansion became the center of chaos. Unmarked cars pulled into the driveway. Investigators and uniformed officers filed inside, their presence breaking the silence that had once served as his shield. Edward, dressed in a tailored suit for a meeting that would never happen, stood frozen as strangers flooded his home. His empire, so carefully constructed, was being dismantled before his eyes. At the heart of the raid was Margaret Miller. Investigators entered her room and found her nearly motionless, slumped in a chair, her skin pale, her eyelids heavy. Tubes and bottles lined her nightstand, each label screaming evidence of overmedication. Independent doctors, brought in on an emergency call, quickly confirmed Naomi's fears. Margaret wasn't simply declining from Alzheimer's. She was being chemically subdued, Her willpower smothered under doses meant to silence rather than heal. The reality hit like a thunderclap. What Naomi had uncovered wasn't negligence. It was calculated abuse. Edward had demanded his mother be kept calm at any cost, and Dr. Stephen Blake had supplied the means. Together, they had conspired to bury an inconvenient life beneath a haze of sedation. Naomi's recordings surfaced next. Audio clips filled the airwaves, each one sharper than the last. Margaret's fragile voice could be heard pleading for freedom, whispering that her son called her a burden, confessing that she feared being locked away. Then came Edward's own words, crisp, unmistakable, ordering Blake to increase doses so his mother would not embarrass him in front of colleagues. The sound was damning, impossible to spin. News outlets seized the story. Within hours, headlines exploded across national media. Millionaire accused of drugging his mother. Broadcasts replayed Naomi's evidence, splicing her name with phrases like whistleblower and hero caregiver. The story wasn't just about one family anymore. It became a mirror held up to society, exposing the way power could smother the most vulnerable. Edward's rage turned to desperation. He shouted at investigators, demanded to see warrants, and threatened lawsuits. But his voice, once powerful enough to silence boardrooms, now rang hollow. Cameras rolled outside his mansion gates, capturing every moment of his fall. Investors cut ties. Board members resigned. His name, once synonymous with success, became shorthand for cruelty. Dr. Blake faced his own reckoning. Arrested in the middle of his office, he was charged with fraudulent prescribing, elder abuse, and medical malpractice. His license was revoked on the spot, this time with no chance of appeal. The man who once hid behind a title was stripped bare, exposed as a predator who had preyed on the weak. For Naomi, the climax was not victory but vindication. She watched the events unfold from her small apartment, her son Jordan by her side. When footage of the raid aired on television, she covered her mouth in shock. Margaret, once nearly lifeless, was shown being transferred to a hospital, her eyes fluttering open as fresh air touched her face. Doctors began detoxifying her system, slowly pulling her back from the edge. And then came the moment Naomi had feared yet hoped for, Margaret's recovery. In the sterile brightness of a hospital room, freed from the chemical fog, Margaret clutched Naomi's hands. Her eyes, clearer now, welled with tears. Her whispered words carried more weight than any verdict could. "I knew you would save me." The power of those words rippled outward. Naomi was no longer invisible, no longer just the maid. She had become the voice for those silenced by money, manipulation, and neglect. Her courage had dragged truth into the light, and that light revealed everything Edward fought to hide. Yet, the story did not end with Margaret's rescue. The legal consequences began to stack like bricks around Edward. Prosecutors built their case swiftly, armed with documents, recordings, and medical reports. He was charged not only with elder abuse but also with fraud and conspiracy. This was no minor scandal. This was a collapse. Courtrooms filled with reporters, their cameras flashing as Edward entered in handcuffs. Once untouchable, he now stood as a symbol of downfall, a reminder that wealth could not buy absolution. Jurors listened to every detail, every damning piece of Naomi's evidence, until the weight of it became unbearable. The verdict was clear. Edward Miller was sentenced to 5 years in prison without parole. Alongside the sentence came heavy fines and an order for over 1,000 hours of community service in nursing facilities, the very places he once dismissed as burdensome. For a man obsessed with control, it was the ultimate humiliation. The climax wasn't just his fall. It was the rise of a woman no one expected. Naomi Carter, once seen as disposable, became the face of courage. She proved that truth, armed with determination, could topple even the wealthiest of empires. And yet, as the cameras turned away from the courtroom, one lingering question hung in the air. If this could happen inside the mansion of a millionaire, How many other voices were still being silenced behind closed doors? When the dust finally settled, Naomi's life was forever changed. The mansion, once a place where she moved silently in the shadows, became the backdrop of national headlines. Reporters crowded the iron gates, not to film the wealth inside, but to tell the story of a black woman who refused to be silenced. For the first time, Naomi's name was spoken with respect, not as the help, not as the maid, but as the woman who uncovered the truth. Margaret's recovery was slow but miraculous. Freed from the fog of unnecessary medication, she began to recognize faces again. On one bright morning, she held Naomi's hand and whispered, "You saved me." Those words, fragile yet heavy with meaning, were not just gratitude. They were an acknowledgement of humanity, a recognition Naomi had been denied for so long. But while Margaret healed, Naomi carried scars that no courtroom verdict could erase. The whispered slurs, the cold stares, the daily reminders that her skin made her expendable. Those wounds didn't disappear. For every person who praised her bravery, others muttered that she was lucky to even have been employed in a house like Edward's. Some dismissed her as opportunistic, claiming she destroyed a family for her own gain. That is the cruel paradox of racism. Even when truth is undeniable, dignity is negotiable. Naomi's story resonated because it was bigger than one wealthy man, bigger than one neglected woman. It was about how society treats the vulnerable when they are hidden behind closed doors, and who is believed when they finally speak. Her courage forced the world to confront uncomfortable questions. Why did it take months of recordings, bruises of evidence, and the near death of an old woman for anyone to listen to a black caregiver? Would the world have reacted the same if Naomi's skin were lighter? The answer, though unspoken, echoed loudly. For Naomi, the resolution was not found in court documents or media interviews. It was in the faces of other caregivers, mostly women of color, who began reaching out to her. They told their own stories of exploitation, of being dismissed, of protecting families that saw them as invisible. Naomi realized she had unintentionally become their voice, a symbol that one person's courage could ignite collective change. Community organizations rallied around her. She began speaking publicly, not just about Margaret's case, but about the countless untold stories of racial injustice woven into caregiving, medicine, and power. Her voice carried weight now, not because she sought fame, but because she carried truth. And yet, Naomi never forgot the loneliness of her fight. She often wondered how many others had been silenced simply because they didn't have a recorder in their pocket, or because no media cameras ever arrived. How many Edward Millers were still out there, using their wealth as armor, convinced they would never be exposed. This is where the story reaches beyond Naomi. It reaches us, because racism is not just found in the cruelty of one man. It's in the systems that protect him, in the disbelief that greets the voices of the marginalized, in the slow-moving justice that only stirs when evidence becomes undeniable. Edward's downfall was dramatic, but it was also rare. For every case that makes headlines, how many others are buried in silence? And so, Naomi's story leaves us with a choice. We can consume it as entertainment, shake our heads, feel anger, maybe shed a tear, and then move on. Or we can see it for what it truly is, a mirror. A reminder that racism is not history, not a relic of the past, but a living force that shapes who is heard, who is believed, and who is forgotten. If we walk away unchanged, then Edward wins. His fall becomes nothing more than a scandal to be forgotten with the next headline. But if we take Naomi's courage as a challenge, if we choose to listen more closely, to believe more readily, and to confront injustice more boldly, then her struggle was not in vain. Naomi Carter stood alone once, but she should not have to stand alone again. So, I ask you, what will you do the next time you see someone dismissed because of the color of their skin? Will you stay silent, or will you speak? Because silence protects the powerful. But truth, spoken aloud, has the power to tear empires down. Naomi's journey is more than just a story. It's a reminder of how easily voices can be silenced, and how much courage it takes to stand against injustice. What do you think about her fight for dignity and truth? Do you believe stories like hers are happening all around us, hidden behind closed doors? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories that need to be heard.